In the time before the war came, the Atlantic Ocean kept its own counsel. Stretched from the shores of Europe and Africa to the coasts of the Americas, 3,000 miles of open water that had witnessed the passage of centuries, the exploration ships of Columbus and Cabot, the slave vessels of the Middle Passage, the immigrant steamers carrying millions to new lives. The Atlantic was highway and barrier, connector and separator, the great water that had shaped the modern world through what it permitted and what it prevented. In September 1939, as armies massed on European borders and the world held its breath, the Atlantic waited too, waited for what was coming, waited to become the battlefield that would determine everything. It is said that Winston Churchill understood the Atlantic's importance more clearly than anyone. Would later write that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Would call the Battle of the Atlantic the dominating factor all through the war. Would understand that Britain was an island nation that could not feed itself, could not fuel its factories, could not arm its soldiers without the supplies that must cross the ocean. The Atlantic was not merely important, was essential. Was the difference between survival and starvation, between resistance and surrender, between hope and despair. Britain imported over 50 million tons of goods each year before the war. Food to feed a population that could not grow enough on its limited farmland. Oil to fuel the ships and planes and tanks that military operations required. Steel and aluminum and rubber, and countless other materials that modern warfare consumed in quantities that domestic production could never supply. All of this had to cross the Atlantic. All of this had to survive whatever waited in those 3,000 miles of open water. If the imports stopped, if the convoys failed, if the Atlantic became impassable, then everything else became meaningless. The war would be lost not through military defeat but through slow starvation. Beneath the surface of this ocean, we can feel the weight of what was at stake. Not territory in the traditional sense, no land to be captured, no cities to be occupied, no flags to be planted. What was at stake was flow itself, the movement of ships, the passage of cargo, the connection between the New World's resources and the Old World's need. The Germans understood this as clearly as the British had learned during the First World War how close they had come to severing that connection, how the submarine warfare of 1917 had nearly succeeded in starving Britain into submission before American intervention and convoy tactics had turned the tide. The lesson was clear. If the Atlantic could be closed, if the ships could be stopped, Britain could be defeated without invasion, without the costly assault across the English Channel that would otherwise be required. The U-boat arm that Germany was building in the late 1930s was designed for exactly this purpose. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded submarines in the First War, who had been captured after his boat was sunk, who had spent years developing tactics and training crews, understood what submarines could do, understood their limitations to their slow speed when submerged, their vulnerability to detection, their need to surface for air and to recharge batteries. But he also understood their potential. A submarine operating alone was vulnerable. Submarines operating together, coordinating their attacks, overwhelming the escorts that protected convoys, this was something different. This was the wolf pack. This was the tactic that might succeed where earlier efforts had failed. The British remembered 1917. Remembered how the unrestricted submarine warfare had sunk ship after ship, how the losses had mounted toward catastrophe, how the convoy system had finally provided the answer. The convoy system was simple in concept: gather merchant ships into groups, provide escorts to protect them, make the submarines find the concentrated target rather than scattered prey. Simple in concept, complex in execution. Required coordination and timing, required escorts that were never numerous enough, required merchant captains to accept the discipline of sailing in formation when their instinct was for independence. But the convoy system worked, had worked in the First War, would have to work again. The chapter closes with September 1939. War declared. The first U-boats already at sea, having departed their bases before hostilities began, waiting in patrol positions for the word that operations could commence. The first convoys forming in British ports, merchant ships gathering in columns, escorts taking position. The ocean stretching between them, vast and cold and indifferent, waiting to witness whatever would unfold upon its waters. The Atlantic held its breath. The hunters were deploying. The hunted were sailing. The longest battle of the war was about to begin. The night holds this ocean gently. The waters that would carry so much hope and so much fear, so much cargo and so many lives, so many ships that would arrive and so many that would not. The Atlantic was about to become something it had never been before, not merely a space to be crossed, but a battlefield to be contested, mile by mile, convoy by convoy, day after day for nearly 6 years. The breath held. The war descended. And the ocean that had witnessed so much history was about to witness more. In the submarine pens of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, in the dockyards where U-boats were built and repaired, in the barracks where crews trained and waited, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. The submarines that Germany was sending into the Atlantic were weapons designed for a specific purpose: to sink the ships that kept Britain alive, to strangle the island nation through undersea ambush, to achieve through submersion what surface fleets could not achieve in open battle. The men who crewed these vessels were volunteers, drawn by adventure and patriotism, by the promise of action, and the knowledge that submarine service offered rewards and dangers that other branches could not match. It is said that life aboard a U-boat was unlike any other military experience. The boats were cramped beyond imagining. Type WWII submarines, the workhorses of the Atlantic campaign, were barely 220 feet long and 20 feet in beam, yet carried crews of over 40 men plus the torpedoes and fuel and supplies required for patrols lasting weeks. Every space served multiple purposes. The torpedo tubes that fired the weapons doubled as bunks for sailors who slept among the ordnance they would launch. The diesel engines that drove the boat on the surface were loud enough to damage hearing, hot enough to make the engine room nearly unbearable. The electric motors that provided propulsion underwater were quieter but consumed batteries that required surfacing to recharge. The air inside a submerged submarine grew thick and foul as oxygen was consumed and carbon dioxide accumulated. The scrubbers that cleaned the air could only do so much. The humidity was constant, condensation forming on every metal surface, dripping onto bunks and equipment and sailors, creating a dampness that never dried. The food spoiled as patrols extended, the fresh provisions consumed first, the canned and preserved rations that followed growing monotonous and sometimes rancid. The toilet facilities were primitive. The privacy was non-existent. The smell that pervaded everything, diesel and sweat and mold and bodies, became invisible to those who lived in it, but announced their presence to anyone not acclimated. Beneath the discomfort, we can feel the danger that defined submarine service. The U-boat was a fragile vessel despite its apparent strength. The pressure hull that kept the ocean out could be breached by depth charges exploding close enough. The systems that sustained life, the air scrubbers, the battery ventilation, the ballast tanks that controlled depth, could be damaged by attacks that seemed to miss. The boat that submerged might not surface. The crew that departed port might not return. The submarine service would suffer the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German military, over 70% of U-boat sailors would die before the war ended. Karl Dönitz commanded this force with the intensity of a man who believed in what he was doing, had served in submarines himself, understood both their potential and their limitations, developed the tactics that would define the Atlantic War: the Wolf Pack, the coordinated assault by multiple submarines on a single convoy. The concept was straightforward. A submarine that found a convoy would shadow it, reporting position by radio. Other submarines would converge on the reported location. When enough had gathered, they would attack together, overwhelming the escorts that could not be everywhere at once. The concept was effective, would prove devastatingly effective in the war's early years. The crews who sailed these boats were young, the average age barely 20. Were trained intensively in the techniques of submarine warfare, the approach procedures, the torpedo solutions, the emergency drills that might mean difference between survival and death. Were led by commanders who ranged from cautious to aggressive, from brilliant to merely competent, from those who would become legends to those who would become statistics. The best commanders developed intuition for when to attack and when to wait, when to dive, and when to remain on the surface, when to pursue, and when to break off. The intuition could not be taught, had to be learned through experience that many would not survive long enough to acquire. The chapter closes with U-boats departing their pens, slipping through harbor defenses, diving as they reached open water. Each boat carried 14 torpedoes, the standard load for a Type WWII. Each torpedo represented a potential ship sunk, a potential cargo lost, a potential crew killed. The wolves were gathering in the darkness of the Atlantic. The convoys were sailing toward them, and the war beneath the waves was about to begin in earnest. The night holds these submarines gently. The steel cylinders that would become both weapon and tomb, home and grave. The crews who sailed in them deserved remembering, not because their cause was just, but because their courage was real, because they faced terrors that test imagination, because they were human beings caught in the machinery of war. The wolves gathered, the hunt commenced, and the darkness of the Atlantic received them. In the ports of Britain and Canada, in Halifax and Liverpool, in Sydney and Glasgow, the merchant ships gathered. They came from every ocean, carrying cargoes from every corner of the globe, converging on the convoy assembly points where they would join with others for the dangerous crossing. They were tramp steamers and tankers, freighters and grain ships, vessels of every size and age and condition, united only by the necessity that brought them together and the dangers they would share. The men who crewed them were merchant seamen, civilians in legal status, combatants in practical reality, facing risks that any soldier would recognize. It is said that the convoy conferences were exercises in controlled anxiety. Masters gathered to receive their instructions, the convoy commodore explaining the formation, the routes to be followed, the signals to be used. Each ship was assigned a position in the convoy grid, a place in the columns that would steam together across the Atlantic. Station keeping was essential. Ships that straggled fell prey to submarines waiting for exactly such opportunities. Ships that crowded caused collisions that could be as deadly as any torpedo. The convoy had to move as a unit despite being composed of vessels with different speeds, different handling characteristics, different crews with different levels of experience. The departure was the beginning of uncertainty. The convoy would form outside the harbor, escorts taking position around the merchantmen, the columns aligning for the long crossing. The course was set not directly toward the destination, but on routes designed to avoid known submarine concentrations, routes that changed based on intelligence, on sightings, on the constant effort to guess where the wolves were waiting. The convoy moved at the speed of its slowest member. Faster ships chafed at the restraint. Slower ships struggled to keep pace. The discipline of convoy sailing demanded what individual sailing never required. Beneath the routine of the crossing, we can feel the fear that never fully subsided. The torpedo could come at any moment, day or night, calm seas or storm. The danger was constant. The lookouts strained to spot periscope feathers or torpedo wakes. The radio operators listened for the signals that might warn of attack. The deck crews stood ready at their stations, prepared for the explosion that might come without warning, the flooding that might follow, the desperate struggle to launch lifeboats before the ship went down. The waiting was perhaps worse than the attack itself, the endless vigilance, the imagination of what might happen, the knowledge that somewhere beneath the dark water, unseen eyes might be watching. The attacks, when they came, were chaos. The flash and boom of the torpedo striking, the ship lurching as the hull was breached. The rush of water into compartments never designed to resist such violence. The alarm bells and shouted orders, and the scramble to reach boat stations before the vessel sank beneath them. Some ships went down in minutes, particularly tankers carrying volatile cargoes that exploded on impact, that turned the ship into inferno before anyone could escape. Other ships lingered, giving crews time to launch boats, to gather provisions, to hope for rescue. The lifeboats were survival's slender hope. Open boats in the North Atlantic, sometimes in winter, where the water temperature could kill in minutes and the air temperature was little better. Men in lifeboats suffered exposure and thirst, hope and despair, watching for the rescue ships that might or might not appear. Escorts could not always stop to pick up survivors, had to continue protecting the convoy, had to pursue submarines if they could be detected, had to make the terrible choice between those already in the water and those still in ships that might be next. Some survivors were rescued within hours. Some drifted for days. Some were never found. The chapter closes with a convoy continuing despite losses. The surviving ships closing the gaps where torpedoed vessels had been, reforming the columns, continuing toward the destination that still lay days away. The escorts searching for submarines they might not find. The commanders calculating odds they could not improve. The ships sailing into silence, not knowing what waited, not knowing if they would arrive, knowing only that they must continue because the cargoes they carried were needed, because the war required them, because stopping was not an option they possessed. The night holds these ships gently. The merchantmen who sailed knowing the risks, the crews who signed on despite what they knew, the voyages completed and the voyages ended in the cold Atlantic waters. The ships that sailed into silence deserve remembering not as abstractions but as vessels with names and histories, crewed by men with families waiting, carrying cargoes that mattered, sailing into dangers they could not avoid. The convoys continued. The losses mounted. And the silence of the Atlantic received what could not be saved. The dance between submarines and escorts was deadly ballet performed in darkness and confusion. The submarines seeking convoys, approaching unseen, attacking and diving and hoping to escape. The escorts searching, listening, dropping depth charges on contacts that might be submarines, or might be thermal layers, or might be nothing at all. Neither side could see the other clearly. Both operated in uncertainty, making decisions based on incomplete information, hoping their guesses were better than their enemies' guesses. The hunters became hunted, and the hunted became hunters in reversals that could happen in moments. It is said that the night surface attack was the U-boat's deadliest tactic. Submarines on the surface were nearly invisible at night low in the water, painted dark gray, showing no silhouette against the sky. ASDIC, the British sonar that could detect submerged submarines, was useless against boats running on the surface. The submarines could approach convoys at their higher surface speed, could fire torpedoes from close range, could slip away before escorts understood what was happening. The Wolf Pack attacks of 1940 and 1941 exploited this vulnerability, ruthlessly multiple submarines attacking simultaneously, torpedoes streaking toward ships from multiple directions, escorts racing to respond to explosions they could not prevent. The escort commander's task was impossible in these early years. Too few ships to adequately protect convoys that might contain 40 or 50 merchantmen. Detection equipment that could not find surfaced submarines at night. Weapons that required the escort to pass directly over the submarine's position, but the submarine moved while the escort approached, breaking contact at the moment when contact was most needed. The escorts that sailed in 1940 and 1941 were often corvettes, small ships designed for coastal work, pressed into ocean escort duty because nothing else was available. Their crews were often newly trained, their equipment often inadequate, their experience limited. They did what they could. It was often not enough. Beneath the technological limitations, we can feel the human drama of these encounters. The escort captain picking up an ASDIC contact, tracking it, calculating the approach, ordering depth charges that might hit or miss. The submarine commander hearing the escort's propellers, hearing the depth charges splash into the water, diving deeper and hoping the explosions would be far enough away. The agonizing seconds waiting for the explosions, the escort hoping for the debris that indicated a kill. The submarine crew knowing that the next pattern might be the one that found them. The depth charges exploded with concussions that could be felt miles away. The submarine that survived one pattern might not survive the next. The survival of a submarine under attack depended on skill and luck in roughly equal measure. The commander who could anticipate the escort's movements, who could order course changes at the right moments, who could control his crew's fear while managing his own, this commander might survive. The commander who panicked, who went too deep or too shallow, who lost control of the boat or the crew, this commander might not. The deep was both refuge and danger. Depth protected against detection but increased the pressure on the hull. Every submarine had a maximum depth beyond which it could not safely go. But safety was relative when depth charges were exploding around you. The escorts were learning, were developing tactics that coordinated multiple ships, one maintaining contact while others attacked, boxing in the submarine with overlapping attacks. We're developing better equipment, radar that could detect surfaced submarines, illumination rounds that stripped away the darkness. We're developing experience that could not be rushed, the institutional knowledge that came only from months and years of hunting and being hunted. The learning would eventually tip the balance. But in 1940 and 1941, the balance still favored the submarines. The chapter closes with the aftermath of an attack, a convoy that has lost ships continuing toward its destination, escorts searching for submarines that have slipped away into the darkness, survivors in the water waiting for rescue, submarines returning to port to report their successes, to be celebrated as heroes, to prepare for the next patrol. The hunters and the hunted, locked in a contest that would continue for years, that would claim thousands of lives on both sides, that would determine whether the Atlantic remained open or was closed forever. The night holds this deadly dance gently. The escorts that searched and the submarines that hid, the attacks that succeeded and the attacks that failed, the victories and defeats that accumulated into the statistics that would determine the war's outcome. The hunters and the hunted, each doing what they had to do, each facing fears that tested every limit. The dance continued. The night was long, and the Atlantic witnessed what neither side fully understood. In a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, in the collection of huts that surrounded it, the most secret work of the war was being conducted. Bletchley Park, the name, would not become known for decades. The work done there would remain classified for 30 years after the war ended. But in those buildings, mathematicians and linguists, chess champions and crossword enthusiasts were doing something that seemed impossible. They were breaking Enigma, the cipher machine that Germany believed was unbreakable, that protected communications throughout the German military, that kept the secrets that made the wolf packs effective. It is said that the Enigma machine was a marvel of cryptographic engineering. 3 rotors that scrambled letters through electrical connections, each rotor advancing with each keystroke, the combinations multiplying with every letter typed. A plug board that added another layer of transposition. Settings that changed daily, that could produce millions of possible configurations. The Germans believed with mathematical justification that the encrypted messages could not be broken by any known method. The belief was almost correct. Almost. The foundation for breaking Enigma had been laid by Polish mathematicians before the war. Marian Rejewski and his colleagues had understood the machine's structure, had built replicas, had developed techniques that could sometimes recover the daily settings. They shared their work with Britain and France before Poland fell. The work continued at Bletchley Park, where a young mathematician named Alan Turing brought insights that transformed what was possible. Turing understood that if certain words could be guessed in a message, whether in weather reports, nothing to report in routine communications, Then the known text could be compared to the encrypted text, and the comparison could reveal the settings. Beneath the mathematical complexity, we can feel the urgency that drove this work. Every day that enigma remained unbroken meant convoys sailing blind, submarines finding targets, ships sinking for lack of warning. Every day that enigma could be read meant convoys rerouted around wolf packs, escorts directed toward submarines, the advantage of surprise shifting to the defenders. The intelligence was called Ultra, the code word for decrypted enigma traffic. Ultra would prove decisive, would change the war in ways that remained secret for decades. The bombs were the machines that made decryption possible at speed. Electromechanical devices designed by Turing and built by British engineers. They could test thousands of rotor settings, could find the day's key if given enough clues to work with. The bombs ran constantly, clicking through possibilities, stopping when a potential match was found. The operators verified the match and passed the settings to the translators. The translators produced the decrypted messages. The messages were analyzed, and the intelligence was distributed always with extreme care to protect the source. The protection of Ultra was perhaps as difficult as the breaking of Enigma itself. If Germany suspected that Enigma was compromised, the machine would be changed, the advantage lost. Every use of ultra-intelligence had to be plausible through other means. Convoys could not simply avoid. Every submarine had to sometimes sail into attacks that could have been prevented. The calculus was brutal. Ships were sacrificed to protect the secret. Sailors died to maintain the deception. The cold arithmetic of war demanded it. The crisis came in February 1942 when the German Navy added a fourth rotor to naval Enigma. The blackout that followed lasted 10 months. During those months, Ultra could not reveal where the submarines were. Losses soared. Dönitz moved his wolf packs with impunity. The battle for the Atlantic reached its most dangerous phase. Then, in December 1942, the new Enigma was broken. The intelligence flowed again. The convoys could be rerouted. The balance began to shift. The chapter closes with the secret victory that remained invisible. The codebreakers who could not speak of what they did, who returned to civilian life after the war and told no one. The intelligence that changed the war but could not be celebrated. The cipher that kept its secrets until those secrets were stolen, read, exploited, and used to destroy those who had trusted it. The greatest secret of the Atlantic War was not the wolf packs or the convoys, but the reading of messages that Germany believed were secure. The night holds this secret gently. The mansion in the countryside. the huts where genius worked in obscurity, the machines that clicked through possibilities, the intelligence that saved ships and sailors while other ships and sailors died to protect the source. The cipher that kept its secrets kept them no longer, and the war that seemed to depend on surface battles was actually being decided by minds working in silence. The year 1942 was when the Atlantic War reached its crisis, when the U-boats achieved successes that threatened to sever Britain's lifeline completely, when the mathematics of ships sunk versus ships built turned decisively against the Allies, when the darkness beneath the waves seemed to be winning, seemed to be closing the ocean, seemed to be achieving what the German strategy had always intended. This was the year that nearly lost the war. This was the year the ocean turned dark. It is said that the numbers told the story. In 1942, U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied ships, more than 6 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. The losses far exceeded new construction. The pool of available ships was shrinking. The cargoes that reached Britain were barely sufficient. The margin between survival and starvation was narrower than it had ever been. Dönitz had more submarines than ever before, over 200 operational boats by year's end, with more being built every month. The wolf packs were larger, more effective, harder to evade. The entry of the United States into the war brought not immediate relief but new catastrophe. American waters were unprepared for submarine warfare. The coastal cities remained lit at night, silhouetting ships against the glow. The convoy system was not immediately implemented. The U-boats that Dönitz dispatched to American waters found hunting grounds beyond their expectations. Operation Drumbeat, the German name for the American campaign, sank ships faster than they could be counted. The second happy time, the submariners called it, echoing the first happy time of 1940, when defenses were equally inadequate. Beneath the statistics, we can feel the desperation of the defenders. The escort group stretched impossibly thin across an ocean that was too vast to cover. The mid-Atlantic gap, where aircraft could not reach, where submarines could operate without fear of attack from above, where convoys were most vulnerable. The shortage of everything, ships and planes and trained crews and equipment, that no amount of determination could overcome. The war was being lost in the Atlantic, and everyone who understood the situation knew it. The tanker losses were particularly devastating. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Every ship, every plane, every tank ran on fuel that had to cross the Atlantic. The tankers that carried it were prime targets, were sought out by submarine commanders who understood their importance. The tankers that were hit often exploded, their volatile cargoes igniting in fireballs that lit the night and incinerated crews before they could escape. The survivors, if there were survivors, swam through water covered with burning oil, seeking lifeboats through flames. The strategic situation was grim. The buildup for eventual invasion of Europe depended on shipping that was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. The support for the Soviet Union, the Lend-Lease convoys that carried tanks and trucks and aircraft to the Eastern Front faced similar dangers. The entire Allied war effort depended on the Atlantic remaining open, and in 1942 it seemed the Atlantic might close, might become impassable, might give Germany the victory it sought. Dönitz pressed his advantage, deployed his submarines in ever larger wolf packs, extended operations into new areas: the Caribbean, the coast of South America, the waters off Africa. Wherever ships sailed, submarines followed. The losses mounted. The crisis deepened. And those who understood what was happening, who saw the numbers, who knew the trends, understood that something had to change or the war would be lost. The chapter closes with the year ending in darkness. The balance sheets showing losses that could not be sustained. The projections showing worse to come if nothing changed. The recognition that 1943 would be decisive, would determine whether the Atlantic could be won or whether it would remain closed, whether the Allies would survive or whether the submarines would succeed in their mission. The ocean had turned dark. The darkness was spreading, and the question of whether dawn would come remained unanswered. The night holds this dark year gently. The ships that sank and the sailors who died, the submarines that hunted with such success, the year when everything hung in balance, when the outcome was truly uncertain, when the war might have been lost if the darkness had persisted. The year 1942 tested everything. The year 1943 would provide the answer. The tide turned through technology and tactics that arrived together, that combined to transform the Atlantic War from disaster to victory. No single weapon or technique was decisive, but together, the innovations that reached the Atlantic in 1943 created conditions that submarines could not survive, that shifted the balance that had favored the hunters to favor the hunted. The weapons that changed the tide were not dramatic in themselves, were incremental improvements, were the accumulation of learning and adaptation that eventually overwhelmed what had seemed overwhelming. It is said that the closing of the Mid-Atlantic Gap was crucial. The air gap, the region in mid-ocean where land-based aircraft could not reach, had been the submarine's sanctuary. In that gap, wolf packs could assemble on the surface, could shadow convoys by day, could attack without fear of aircraft. The very long-range Liberator bombers that became available in 1943 could close that gap, could cover convoys throughout their crossing, could force submarines to submerge and lose contact. The escort carriers, small aircraft carriers, sailing with convoys, brought air power to mid-ocean. The aircraft that flew from these platforms changed everything. Radar had existed before 1943. But the centimetric radar that became available that year was something different. Could detect the small target of a surfaced submarine, could work in conditions that had defeated earlier sets, could strip away the darkness that had protected night surface attacks. The submarines that had relied on being invisible now found themselves illuminated, detected, attacked before they understood they had been seen. The advantage of the night surface attack, the tactic that had made the wolf pack so deadly, was neutralized. Beneath the technology, we can feel the tactical changes that mattered equally. The escort groups that trained together, that developed coordinated procedures, that became skilled at hunting submarines as teams rather than as individual ships. The support groups that could reinforce threatened convoys, that could pursue submarines without leaving merchantmen unprotected. The systematic application of tactics that had been learned through bitter experience, that were now taught and practiced and refined into effective doctrine. The hedgehog was a weapon that solved a fundamental problem. Depth charges had to be dropped from directly above a submarine, but the attacking escort lost ASDIC contact as it passed over the target. The submarine could maneuver during those critical seconds, could be elsewhere when the depth charges exploded. The hedgehog threw its projectiles forward, ahead of the ship, while contact was still maintained. The projectiles sank and exploded only on contact with something solid. If hedgehog exploded, the submarine was hit. The certainty was invaluable. High-frequency direction finding Huff Duff allowed escorts to locate submarines by their radio transmissions. The wolf pack tactics that Dönitz had developed required extensive radio communication, submarines reporting convoy positions, headquarters coordinating attacks, boats exchanging information. Every transmission could be detected, could give bearing to the transmitter, could reveal the location of submarines that thought they were invisible. Huff Duff did not break the coded messages, did not need to. Simply knowing where the transmission originated was enough. The integration of these capabilities was as important as the capabilities themselves. The escort commander in 1943 had tools that the escort commander in 1940 One had lacked radar that could see, aircraft that could search, weapons that could hit, direction finding that could locate. The integration required training and coordination that took time to develop. But by spring of 1943, the Atlantic escort forces had become something that submarine commanders had not faced before, a threat that could find them, track them, destroy them with efficiency that made the old tactics suicidal. The chapter closes with the transformation taking hold. Submarines that had attacked with impunity now died in numbers that could not be replaced. Commanders who had been celebrated as heroes now commanded boats that never returned. The tide was turning. The weapons that had seemed inadequate were proving decisive, and the Atlantic that had been so dark was beginning to show the first light of what might be dawn. The night holds these weapons gently, the aircraft that closed the gap, the radar that pierced the darkness, the tactics that coordinated the hunt. The weapons that changed the tide were not dramatic but were decisive, not revolutionary but were essential. The turn was coming. The dawn was approaching. And the Atlantic War that had seemed lost was about to be won. The Atlantic returned to peace. The convoys dispersed. The submarines that surrendered were studied and then destroyed. The wrecks on the ocean floor were left to the silence of the deep, to the slow processes of corrosion and incrustation that would eventually erase what war had created. The living remembered for a time. Then the living became fewer, and memory became history, and history became the fragments that remain when all who experienced have departed. The ocean remembers what those who pass upon it forget. It is said that the Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of the war, lasted from the first day to the last, was fought every day of the war by someone, somewhere on the ocean. Over 3,500 Allied merchant ships were sunk. Over 72,000 Allied sailors died, merchant seamen, naval personnel, aviators. Over 780 U-boats were destroyed. Over 28,000 German submariners died. The numbers encompass suffering that no statistic can convey, sacrifice that no calculation can capture, lives that cannot be reduced to figures in a ledger. The significance of the Atlantic War extended beyond its own boundaries. Without victory in the Atlantic, no invasion of Europe was possible. The armies that landed at Normandy could not have been assembled without the supplies that crossed the Atlantic. The aircraft that bombed Germany could not have been built without the materials that the convoys carried. The Soviet Union could not have received the Lend-Lease support that helped sustain its war effort. Everything else depended on the Atlantic remaining open. Everything else was possible because the Atlantic was one. Beneath the strategic significance, we can feel the human dimensions that mattered equally. The merchant sailors who were not celebrated as warriors but who faced warriors' risks. The escort crews who spent years hunting an enemy they rarely saw, who succeeded through persistence rather than dramatic victory. The aviators who flew endless patrols over empty ocean, who found submarines rarely but who made the difference when they did. The code breakers whose contribution remained secret for decades, who could never explain what they had done. All deserve remembering. The wrecks remain on the Atlantic floor. The ships that were torpedoed, some with their cargoes still visible, scattered across the seabed. The submarines that were depth-charged, some still intact, some blown apart, all silent now. The debris fields that mark where vessels went down, where men died, where the war was decided. The ocean holds these sites as it holds everything without ceremony, without memorial, without the recognition that human memory might provide. Some sites have been explored. Divers and submersibles have visited wrecks, have photographed what remains, have brought images to the surface that connect the living to the dead. Most sites remain unvisited, too deep, too remote, too numerous to catalog. The ocean is vast. The wrecks are scattered across thousands of miles. The dead rest where they fell, unmarked, uncommemorated, known only to the currents that pass above them. The chapter closes with the ocean continuing its ancient rhythms. The waves that carried convoys and submarines now carry container ships and cruise liners. The depths that witnessed such struggle now witness only the ordinary life of the sea. The memory of the war fades as those who fought it depart, but the ocean remembers, holds what sank into it, preserves what time would otherwise erase. The war was fought and won upon its waters. The victory was paid for by those who rest within its depths. The ocean remembers what the surface has forgotten. The night holds this memory gently. The ocean that was battlefield, the waters that witnessed such courage and such suffering, the deep that became grave for so many. The ocean remembers, and perhaps in remembering we honor what was given, what was lost, what the Atlantic holds in its eternal keeping. May 1943 became known as Black May. Not black for the Allies, but black for the U-boats, black because, in that single month, 43 German submarines were sunk, a loss rate that could not be sustained, that represented catastrophe from which the submarine force would never recover. The turning point of the Atlantic War came in those 31 days, came with a violence that stunned Dönitz, that forced him to recognize what he had refused to see, that the battle had turned against him, that the tactics that had served so well had become death sentences, that continuing as before meant extinction. It is said that the losses of May came suddenly, came after months of success that had seemed to confirm that the wolf packs were winning. The winter of 19,421,943 had seen continued heavy losses for the convoys. The early months of 1943 had brought battles that seemed to favor the submarines. Then, in May, everything changed. The convoys that had been prey became hunters. The escorts that had seemed overwhelmed became predators. The aircraft that had been absent were everywhere. The submarines that attacked found themselves surrounded, found themselves detected, found themselves destroyed before they could understand what had happened. The convergence of factors that produced Black May was years in the making. The closing of the air gap, the improved radar, the Huff Duff that located transmitting submarines, the escort carriers that brought aircraft to mid-ocean, the support groups that could reinforce threatened convoys, the training and experience that had transformed escort forces, the ultra-intelligence that allowed convoys to avoid concentrations and directed escorts toward submarines. Each factor mattered. Together, they were devastating. Beneath the tactical situation, we can feel the psychological impact on the submarine force. The commanders who had sailed with confidence now sailed with dread. The crews who had celebrated victories now awaited deaths. The pens that had launched successful patrols now received fewer returning boats. The telegrams that informed families of losses multiplied. The morale that had sustained the U-boat arm through years of difficult service began to crack under losses that seemed to offer no purpose. Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic on May 24, 1943. The withdrawal was admission of defeat that he would not phrase as such, but that everyone understood. The submarines that had controlled the Atlantic were retreating. The convoys that had suffered such losses would cross with diminished fear. The tide had turned. The darkness was lifting. And the war that had seemed lost was suddenly, unexpectedly being won. The withdrawal was not permanent. Dönitz continued to believe that new technologies might restore the advantage, the schnorkel that would allow submarines to run their diesels while submerged, the faster type XXI boats that were being designed, the acoustic torpedoes that would home on escort propellers. He would send his submarines back. They would continue to fight. They would continue to die, but they would never again dominate as they had dominated. The crisis of 1942 and early 1943 would not return. The Atlantic was opening. The turning could not be seen from beneath the waves. The submarine commander who dived to escape aircraft, who heard depth charges exploding around him, who surfaced into a world where every horizon seemed to hold a threat, this commander saw only his immediate danger, could not see the aggregate, the pattern, the transformation that was occurring across thousands of square miles of ocean, could only try to survive, could only hope to complete his patrol and return. Many would not return. The turning was visible only in the statistics that accumulated after the fact, that revealed what individual experience could not perceive. The chapter closes with the Atlantic changed, the convoys sailing with reduced losses, the submarines dying faster than they could achieve results, the strategy that Germany had pursued since the war's beginning failing beyond recovery. The turning point had passed. The victory was not yet complete, would require 2 more years of effort, but the crisis was over. The darkness that had seemed total was yielding to light. The night holds this turning gently. The month of May when everything changed. The submarines that died in numbers that destroyed the force. The withdrawal that acknowledged what combat had proved. The turning that could not be seen from beneath the waves, but that was real nonetheless. The Atlantic War continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The war continued after the turning point, continued for 2 more years, through 1944 and into 1945, through the invasion of Normandy and the advance across Europe and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The submarines continued to sail, continued to attack, continued to die. But the character of the war had changed. What had been desperate struggle for survival had become mopping up operation. What had been crisis had become attrition. The U-boats that still hunted did so in a different world, a world where the hunters had become hunted, where every patrol was more dangerous than the last, where the final hunts proceeded in fading light. It is said that Dönitz never accepted that the war was lost, continued to believe that new technologies would restore the advantage. The Schnorkel allowed submarines to run their diesels while submerged, to recharge batteries without surfacing, to avoid the radar that had made surface running suicidal. The acoustic torpedo that homed on propeller noise offered the possibility of hitting escorts without precise aim. The Type XXI submarines, faster underwater than any previous design, promised to restore the mobility that had been lost. But the technologies came too late, in quantities too small to change the outcome. The submarines that sailed in 1944 faced a transformed Atlantic. The escort groups were larger, more experienced, more deadly. The air coverage was nearly continuous. The intelligence that directed convoys and directed hunts was comprehensive. The submarines that found convoys often found themselves surrounded before they could attack. The submarines that attacked often died before they could escape. The exchange rate that had once favored Germany now favored the Allies by margins that made continued submarine operations futile. Beneath the statistics, we can feel the experience of submarine crews in these final years. The patrols that lasted weeks, that achieved nothing, that required constant diving to escape aircraft. The attacks on coastal shipping rather than convoys, because convoys had become too well defended. The mining operations, the weather reporting, the missions that had little chance of success but that were ordered because something had to be done. The knowledge, growing among commanders and crews, that the war was lost, that each patrol might be the last, that they were dying for a cause that was already defeated. The D-Day invasion of June 1944 brought the U-boats into the Channel, where they attempted to disrupt the supply of the Allied armies in France. The attempts failed. The concentration of Allied anti-submarine forces was overwhelming. The submarines that approached the beaches died. The invasion succeeded. The war moved to its conclusion with the submarine force watching helplessly, unable to intervene, unable to affect the outcome. The final months saw submarines sailing from Norwegian ports into waters dominated by Allied forces. Saw crews departing on patrols from which return was improbable. Saw commanders continuing to fight because surrender was not permitted, because duty demanded, because hope persisted against all evidence. The submarines that were sunk in 1945 were sunk in a war already lost, were sacrificed to a cause already defeated, were deaths that served no strategic purpose. The chapter closes with the war ending, the U-boats receiving orders to surrender, to surface and fly black flags, to sail to Allied ports where they would be interned. Over 200 submarines surrendered. Others were scuttled by their crews rather than handed over. The fleet that had threatened to win the war was finished. The crews that had served with such courage faced imprisonment and an uncertain future. The final hunts were over. The fading light had given way to darkness, and the darkness to the silence of defeat. The night holds these final patrols gently, the submarines that sailed knowing the odds, the crews that served in conditions of decreasing hope, the commanders who continued fighting because stopping was not an option they could choose. The final hunts in fading light deserve remembering, not because the cause was just, but because the courage was real, because the suffering was genuine, because the ending was as much a part of the story as the beginning. The Atlantic holds its dead in silence. The ships that were torpedoed and the submarines that were depth-charged, the sailors who escaped their sinking vessels, and the sailors who were trapped within them, all rest now in the darkness of the deep, in the cold that never warms, in the quiet that is disturbed only by the currents that pass above them. The numbers are statistics until we remember that each number was a person, that each sinking was a death or many deaths, that the Atlantic War was fought not by abstractions, but by human beings who hoped and feared and died. It is said that over 30,000 merchant seamen died in the Atlantic during the war. 30,000 civilians who went to sea knowing the risks, who sailed again after surviving sinkings, who kept the ships moving because the ships had to move. They were not soldiers in legal status, were not always honored as soldiers after the war, but they faced dangers that any soldier would recognize, and they died in numbers that any soldier would acknowledge. The merchant marine was the forgotten service, essential to everything and celebrated for nothing. The submariners died in greater proportion. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, over 28,000 died a casualty rate of roughly 70%. No other service approached this figure. The submariner who departed on patrol had better than even odds of never returning. The knowledge sat with every crew, accompanied every dive, waited in every depth-charge attack. They served knowing what awaited. Many served with extraordinary courage. Most died without recognition, without graves, without anyone knowing precisely where or how their end came. Beneath the statistics, we can feel the individual deaths that composed them. The torpedo strike in the engine room, the flooding that followed, the engineers trapped as compartments filled. The depth charge that cracked the pressure hull, the inrush of water that could not be stopped, the boat diving beyond recovery into depths where the hull finally collapsed, the lifeboat adrift for days, the survivors dying one by one of exposure and thirst, the boat eventually found empty or not found at all. Each death was unique. Each carried its own terror and its own dignity. The cold of the North Atlantic was itself a weapon. Water temperatures that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. The survivors who escaped their ships often escaped into that cold, into water that began killing them immediately. The lucky ones reached lifeboats quickly. The unlucky ones died before rescue was possible. The winter convoys were worse, the cold compounding every other danger, the survivors facing hypothermia even if they escaped the water. The submarine deaths had particular horror. The boats that could not surface, that sank beyond their crush depth, that carried crews to deaths that imagination struggles to encompass. The pressure that increased as the boat descended, that tested the hull and eventually defeated it. The sound of rivets popping, of seams giving way, of the ocean entering. The darkness because the electrical systems failed as the boat died, and the cold, and the rising water, and the knowledge that there was no escape, that the surface was impossibly far, that this steel tube would be their tomb. Some submarines rest at known locations mapped by surveys, sometimes visited by divers or submersibles. Most rest in anonymity, sunk in positions that were never precisely recorded, located somewhere in the vast darkness of the Atlantic floor. The crews who sailed in them rest with them. The ocean keeps their secrets. The depths that received them hold them still. The chapter closes with the recognition that the Atlantic War was paid for in lives, not just in victory and defeat, not just in tonnage sunk and submarines destroyed, but in human beings who died far from home, who were mourned by families who often never knew the details, who rest now in the silence of the deep. The depths where sailors sleep hold them gently. The ocean that was their battlefield is their cemetery. And the war that was fought upon and beneath its waters is written in the lives that were lost and the resting places that will never be visited. The night holds these dead gently. The merchant sailors who kept the ships sailing, the naval crews who hunted and protected, the submariners who served knowing the odds, all deserve remembering. All deserve acknowledgement that their deaths mattered, that their sacrifice contributed, that the war was won in part because of what they gave. The depths hold them. The silence surrounds them, and the Atlantic keeps its dead in the darkness that knows no dawn. And so we arrive at the silence that follows all wars, the silence that settles when the guns stop and the ships stop sinking and the submarines stop hunting, the silence that the Atlantic has returned to, that it held before the war came and that it holds now that the war has passed. The silence between the waves is the ocean's own voice, unchanged by what transpired upon its surface, indifferent to the struggles that seemed so important to those who fought them. The ocean continues. The memory fades. And what remains is the silence that was always there, beneath the noise, waiting for the noise to end. It is said that we study history to understand the present, to see how we came to where we are, to recognize that the world we inherited was not inevitable but was made through choices, through sacrifices, through the courage and the suffering of those who came before. The Atlantic War offers this understanding, shows how close the outcome was, shows how much depended on decisions that might have been made differently, shows that the world we know exists because the Atlantic was won, because the convoys got through, because the submarines were eventually defeated. The lessons of the Atlantic War extend beyond its specific circumstances. The lesson of persistence that wars are not won through single decisive battles, but through the daily accumulation of effort, through the convoys that must continue sailing, through the escorts that must continue protecting, through the determination that must not flag even when the outcome seems impossible. The lesson of adaptation that the side that learns faster, that adjusts to changing circumstances, that develops new capabilities and new tactics, will eventually prevail. The lesson of sacrifice that some will die so that others may live, that the cost of victory is paid by those who do not survive to enjoy it. Beneath the lessons, we can feel something harder to articulate. The recognition that the Atlantic War was fought by human beings who experienced fear and hope, who suffered and endured, who died far from home in cold water or dark submarines. The recognition that the statistics that summarize the campaign obscure the individual experiences that composed it. The recognition that what we remember as history was, for those who lived it, simply life difficult and dangerous and often terrifying, but also routine in ways that made the extraordinary ordinary. The survivors who remained after the war carried what they had experienced for the rest of their lives, carried the memories of shipmates lost, carried the knowledge of what they had faced and what they had done, carried the silence of those who had seen too much to speak easily of what they had seen. Most are gone now. The last veterans of the Atlantic War are departing, and with them goes the direct connection to what happened, the living memory that will become only history. The chapter closes with the Atlantic as it is now, the shipping lanes that carry the commerce of the world, the cruise ships and cargo vessels that cross without fear of submarines, the peace that allows us to forget what was once at stake, what was once required, what was once paid. The silence between the waves holds what the surface no longer reveals. The depths hold what the living no longer remember, and the ocean that witnessed such struggle now witnesses only the ordinary passage of those who travel upon it. The night holds this silence gently. The war is over. The dead rest. The living have mostly departed. The ocean continues its eternal rhythms, unchanged by what transpired, unmoved by what was lost. The silence between the waves is the final truth of the Atlantic War, that even the greatest struggles end, that even the deepest sacrifices are eventually forgotten, that even the ocean that held the fate of nations returns to its own concerns, indifferent to those who fought upon its waters, holding their memory in depths that no one visits. Sleep comes gently now. The 12 chapters we have explored settle into memory. The submarines and the convoys, the hunters and the hunted, the weapons and the tactics, the victories and the losses all find their place in the story that we have constructed tonight. The story is incomplete. All stories are incomplete, but it is what we have, what we offer, what we carry into tomorrow. And so our journey ends. Through the years of struggle beneath the Atlantic waves, through the convoys that sailed and the submarines that hunted, through the victories and defeats that accumulated into the statistics that determined the war's outcome. We have traced the arc of the Atlantic War from its beginning in September 1939 to its end in May 1945. From the first torpedoes to the last surrender. From the crisis that nearly lost the war to the victory that made everything else possible. It is said that war is a test of courage, of endurance, of will, of the capacity to persist when persistence seems impossible. The Atlantic War was such a test, was 6 years of testing that never relented, that demanded daily what most people are never asked to give. The sailors who served in that war on merchant ships and warships, in submarines and aircraft, gave what was demanded. Many gave their lives. Those who survived gave years of their youth, years of fear and hardship and the constant presence of death. What they gave made possible what followed, what remains when the telling ends. Perhaps a sense of gratitude. The world we inherited was made possible by those who fought the Atlantic War. The supplies that reached Britain, the invasion of Europe, the defeat of Nazi Germany, all depended on the Atlantic remaining open. All were achieved because of what the sailors of the Atlantic gave. We are beneficiaries of their sacrifice, whether we acknowledge it or not. Perhaps a sense of humility. The war was not won by heroes in the mythic sense, was won by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, was won through fear and determination, through suffering and endurance, through the daily choice to continue when continuing was all that remained. The ordinary became extraordinary through what circumstances demanded. The humility comes from recognizing that we might not have done as well, that what they gave cannot be taken for granted, that the courage required was genuine and remarkable. Perhaps a sense of connection. The dead rest in the Atlantic still. The wrecks remain on the ocean floor. The silence holds what the surface has forgotten. We are connected to those who served by the world they preserved, by the history they made, by the memory that we carry forward. The connection does not fade when the last veterans depart. Becomes something different, becomes history rather than memory, but does not end. The Atlantic continues. Will continue long after all who remember the war have gone. Will continue to carry the ships that now sail in peace. Will continue to hold what sank into its depths during those years of struggle. The ocean is patient, holds its dead without ceremony, waits through the centuries for whatever will be placed within its keeping. The war was moment in the ocean's existence. The moment has passed. The ocean continues. Sleep well, dear listener. The journey has been long. The waters have been dark. The rest is earned. And when morning comes, as morning always comes, the Atlantic will be there, peaceful now, holding in its depths what peace required to be purchased. The deep holds all. The silence remains. And the memory of what was fought and won upon these waters becomes part of what we carry, part of what we are, part of the history that shapes our present and our future. The submarines rest. The convoys have arrived. The war is over. And the Atlantic keeps its vigil now and always over those who sailed upon it and those who sank within it, over the hunters and the hunted, over the war that was fought in its waters and the peace that finally came. Good night. Dream of the sailors who served. Dream of the ocean that witnessed. Dream of the silence that followed the storm. The deep holds all, the memory endures, and the Atlantic rests at last in peace, forever silent, forever keeping, forever the ocean that held the fate of nations. Good night.